A Chihuahua comes face to face with bulls, and everyone was shocked by what happened. Gary Mitchell had run his cattle station in the Northern Territory for 37 years, and in all that time he'd never seen anything quite like what happened that scorching afternoon in February. His herd of 15 Brahman bulls, each weighing close to a ton, stood in the dusty paddock near the homestead, and facing them, all 1.8 kilograms of her, was Peanut, the tiny tan Chihuahua that belonged to his granddaughter Emma. Emma, 8 years old, had come to stay at the station for the school holidays. She'd brought Peanut with her despite Gary's reservations. Cattle stations weren't places for toy dogs, he'd told his daughter Sarah. Too many dangers, snakes, dingoes, the cattle themselves. But Emma had cried, and Sarah had insisted the dog would stay inside, and Gary had relented because he was a grandfather, and grandfathers do these things. For the first 3 days, everything had been fine. Peanut stayed in the homestead, yapping at flies and sleeping on Emma's bed. But on the 4th day, someone left the screen door unlatched. Gary was in the machinery shed when he heard Emma's scream. He ran faster than a man of 63 should be able to run, his heart pounding with the terror that every station owner knows, that awful certainty that something terrible has happened. He found Emma standing at the paddock fence, tears streaming down her face, pointing towards the bulls, and there, in the middle of the paddock, was Peanut. The tiny dog had apparently chased a lizard through a gap in the fence that nothing larger than a rabbit should have been able to squeeze through. Now she stood frozen in the open ground, having finally noticed the massive animals surrounding her. The bulls had noticed her too. 15 heads turned in unison towards this strange, yapping creature. Gary's blood ran cold. Bulls were unpredictable animals. They could be placid one moment and lethal the next. He'd seen a bull kill a dog before, years ago. One swift movement of that massive head, horns glinting in the sun, and Peanut would be dead before anyone could blink. "Stay there, Emma," Gary commanded, already moving towards the paddock gate. "Don't you dare come in here." But even as he ran, he knew he wouldn't make it in time. The largest bull, a massive beast they called Brutus, was already moving towards Peanut. The dog, sensing danger, had stopped yapping. She stood utterly still, her tiny body trembling, her enormous eyes fixed on the approaching mountain of muscle and horn. Gary vaulted the fence, shouting, waving his arms, trying to distract the bulls. But they weren't looking at him. Every single one of them was focused on Peanut. Brutus reached her first. He lowered his enormous head, his horns easily twice as long as Peanut's entire body. Gary was still 30 meters away, too far, too slow, and then something happened that Gary would struggle to explain for the rest of his life. Brutus stopped. His massive head hovered over Peanut, his breath stirring the fur on her back. The dog looked up at the bull, and the bull looked down at the dog. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the world held its breath. Then Brutus did something that made Gary stop running and simply stare. The massive bull lowered his head further and gently, impossibly gently, nudged Peanut with his nose. Not a violent shove, not an attack, but something that looked almost like curiosity. Peanut, instead of running or cowering, reached up with her tiny paw and touched Brutus's nose. The other bulls moved closer, forming a circle around Peanut. Gary's station hand, Tommy, had arrived and stood next to Emma at the fence, both of them frozen in disbelief. Every instinct told Gary this should end in violence, that at any second one of these bulls would crush the tiny dog. But they didn't. They simply stood there, these massive creatures, gazing down at this impossibly small animal who had wandered into their territory. "Boss, what are they doing?" Tommy whispered, his voice tight with tension. "I have no bloody idea," Gary replied, taking another cautious step forward. Peanut, showing either remarkable courage or complete ignorance of her danger, began to walk. She moved through the circle of bulls, weaving between legs thick as tree trunks, her tail held high. The bulls moved with her, turning their heads to follow her progress, but making no aggressive moves. It was as if they were protecting her, escorting her. Gary moved slowly, carefully, closer to the scene. He could see Emma crying at the fence, her small hands gripping the rails. Sarah had arrived now too. Having heard the commotion from the house, she grabbed Emma, holding her back, her own face pale with fear. Peanut continued her strange procession through the herd. She seemed to be heading towards the fence, towards Emma, as if she'd suddenly remembered where she belonged. The bulls moved with her, this bizarre honor guard of massive animals shepherding the tiny dog across the paddock. Brutus walked directly behind her, his head lowered, as if ready to scoop her up with his horns if she stumbled. When Peanut reached the fence, she squeezed through the same gap she'd entered by. Emma immediately scooped her up, sobbing with relief, pressing the little dog against her chest. The bulls stood at the fence, watching. Brutus made a low sound in his throat, not aggressive, but something else. Something Gary had never heard a bull make before. What the hell just happened? Sarah breathed. Gary shook his head, wiping sweat from his face. His hands were shaking. I don't know. I've been working with cattle my whole life, and I've never seen anything like that. Those bulls should have killed her. Any one of them could have. But they didn't. They walked her home. Tommy, who was indigenous and had grown up on the land, spoke quietly. My grandfather used to say that sometimes animals know things we don't, that they can sense something in another creature. A spirit, maybe. Something that makes them protect instead of harm. Gary looked at Peanut, now safe in Emma's arms, licking the tears from the girl's face. Then he looked at the bulls, still standing at the fence, still watching. Brutus met his eyes, and in that moment, Gary felt something shift in his understanding of the animals he'd worked with for decades. That evening, Gary sat on the veranda with Sarah, both nursing cold beers, while Emma slept inside with Peanut curled against her. The sun was setting over the red earth, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. But Gary's mind kept replaying the scene in the paddock. "You should have seen it, Sarah," he said for the third time. The way Brutus looked at her. "I've worked with that bull for 5 years. He's sent 3 blokes to hospital. He's aggressive, territorial, mean as a snake. But today he was gentle as a lamb with that tiny dog." "Maybe he could sense she wasn't a threat," Sarah suggested. "She's so small, maybe he just saw her as... I don't know, not worth the effort." "No," Gary shook his head firmly. "It wasn't that. He protected her. They all did. It was deliberate, like they understood she was vulnerable and needed help. The next morning, something even stranger happened. Gary was doing his usual rounds, checking water troughs and fences, when he noticed the bulls were all gathered at the fence line nearest the homestead. They were staring towards the house. At first, Gary thought something was wrong. Bulls acting oddly often meant trouble, a snake in the paddock or a dingo nearby. Then he saw Peanut. The little dog had somehow gotten out again, probably through that same gap in the screen door. But this time she hadn't gone into the paddock. She was sitting on her side of the fence, looking at the bulls, and they were looking back at her. Brutus was at the front, his massive head lowered, as close to the fence as he could get. "You've got to be kidding me," Gary muttered. Emma came running out of the house, having noticed Peanut was missing. "Grandpa, she's there again." "I can see that, love. Come here, stay with me." They watched as Peanut stood up and walked along the fence line. The bulls moved with her, 15 massive animals following the progress of this tiny dog. When Peanut stopped, they stopped. When she moved, they moved. It was like some bizarre dance, this unlikely connection between the smallest and largest creatures on the property. "They're friends," Emma said with the simple certainty of a child. Peanut made friends with the bulls. Gary wanted to dismiss it as childish fantasy, but he couldn't, because that's exactly what it looked like. Over the following days, it became a routine. Peanut would go to the fence, and the bulls would come. Sometimes they'd just stand there, this odd congregation. Other times, Peanut would run along the fence, yapping, and the bulls would walk alongside her, their massive heads turning to track her movement. Tommy took videos on his phone, posting them to social media. Within days, the videos had gone viral. News outlets from Sydney, Melbourne, even international media were calling. They wanted to come film this impossible friendship. Gary, who valued his privacy, reluctantly agreed to let one news crew visit, mainly because Emma begged him. The journalist, a young woman named Kate from Brisbane, arrived with a cameraman. She was skeptical at first, clearly thinking the videos had been exaggerated or somehow faked. But when she saw Peanut at the fence, with all 15 bulls gathered around, her jaw literally dropped. "This is incredible," she breathed, as the cameraman filmed. Bulls are typically aggressive animals, especially Brahmins. They're not known for being gentle or forming bonds with other species, but look at them. They're completely focused on this dog. Gary explained what had happened that first day, how Brutus had walked Peanut to safety. Kate interviewed Emma, who told the camera with complete confidence that Peanut and the bulls were best friends forever. "Why do you think they like her?" Kate asked Emma. "Because she's brave," Emma replied. "She's tiny, but she's not scared, and they know she's special. Animals always know." The story aired on the national news. The segment was titled "The Chihuahua Who Charmed Bulls." Gary's phone didn't stop ringing. Animal behaviorists wanted to study the phenomenon. A university in Queensland offered to send researchers. A children's book publisher wanted to turn it into a story. But for Gary, the most important change was how he saw his own animals. For decades, he'd viewed his bulls purely as livestock, as economic units to be managed. He'd respected them, certainly, understood their strength and danger, but he'd never really considered them as individuals with their own capacity for, compassion, intelligence, whatever it was that made them protect a defenseless dog instead of harming it. Dr. Sarah Chen, an animal behaviorist from Sydney University, eventually came to study the interaction. She spent 3 days at the station, observing, taking notes, filming. On her last evening, she sat with Gary on the veranda. "I've seen some remarkable animal behaviors in my career," she said, "but this is genuinely unique. Bulls are herd animals with complex social structures, but they typically don't extend that social recognition to other species, especially not predators or potential threats. Small dogs can seem like threats to large animals, triggering defensive aggression. So why didn't they attack her?" Gary asked. "Honestly, I can't give you a definitive scientific answer, but I have a theory. That first day, when Peanut froze in the paddock, she submitted. She stopped yapping, stopped moving, made herself as non-threatening as possible. In bull social hierarchy, submission is recognized and usually accepted. Brutus, as the dominant bull, approached to investigate, and in that moment something clicked. Maybe he recognized her vulnerability. Maybe her size triggered some protective instinct we don't fully understand. Whatever happened, he made a decision to protect rather than attack. And the others followed his lead, Gary said, understanding because Brutus is the boss. If he decided Peanut was under his protection, they all accepted it. Exactly. What's remarkable is that the bond has persisted. Peanut returns to the fence, the bulls respond. It's become a ritual, a genuine relationship. I've documented everything, but I suspect other scientists will be skeptical. It's just too unusual. So what do I do? Gary asked. Emma goes home in a week. She'll take Peanut with her. What happens to the bulls then? Dr. Chen looked thoughtful. I don't know. This might be something they forget quickly, or it might affect them. Animals can grieve, form attachments. We might be witnessing something that has genuine emotional weight for these bulls, not just instinctive behavior. The day Emma was due to leave arrived too quickly. Gary had hoped the time would stretch, but it never does when you're dreading something. Sarah had driven up from Darwin to collect Emma and Peanut. The car was packed. Emma's school holidays officially over, this reality calling them back to the city, but Emma was distraught. She'd spent the morning at the fence with Peanut. The bulls gathered as always. She'd cried into Brutus's massive face, trying to explain that she had to go, that she was sorry. The bull had stood perfectly still, letting her small hands touch his nose, his eyes somehow seeming to understand that something was ending. "Grandpa, I can't leave them," Emma sobbed. "They'll be sad. Brutus will miss Peanut." Gary knelt down, his old knees protesting, and took his granddaughter's hands. "Love, the bulls will be all right. They're tough animals. They'll remember Peanut, I reckon, but they'll be fine." But what if they're not? What if they get sad and lonely? Gary didn't have an answer for that, because truthfully, he was wondering the same thing. They said their goodbyes. Peanut was placed in her carrier, still yapping, as if she knew what was happening. As Sarah's car pulled away down the long dirt road, Gary saw all 15 bulls standing at the fence, watching. Brutus was at the front, his head raised, tracking the departing vehicle until it disappeared in a cloud of red dust. That evening, Gary did his rounds. The bulls were still at the fence, still looking towards the road. They hadn't moved to their usual grazing spots. They hadn't gone to the water trough. They just stood there, waiting. "Come on, boys," Gary called. "She's gone. Time to get back to normal." But the bulls didn't move. Brutus turned his head briefly to acknowledge Gary, then returned his gaze to the empty road. The next morning was worse. The bulls were still at the fence. Tommy arrived for work and found Gary staring at them, concern written across his weathered face. "They haven't moved, boss," Tommy asked. "Not since yesterday. They didn't even go for water last night." I had to bring the trough to them. Over the following days, the situation didn't improve. The bulls stayed at the fence line. They grazed nearby, reluctantly, but always returned to that spot where Peanut had visited them. Brutus especially seemed affected. The aggressive, powerful bull that had terrorized stockmen became listless. He barely ate. He just stood there waiting for a tiny dog that wasn't coming back. Gary called Dr. Chen. She listened to his description and was silent for a long moment. "I was afraid of this," she finally said. "They've bonded more deeply than we realized. Bulls can experience distress when separated from herd members. It appears they've extended that attachment to Peanut, Brutus especially. What do I do?" Gary asked, hearing the desperation in his own voice. "I can't watch these animals suffer. Realistically, the attachment will fade with time. A few weeks, maybe a month, they'll return to normal. Or what? Or you bring Peanut back, even just for visits, to show them she's okay, that she hasn't disappeared forever." Gary thought about this conversation for 2 days. He watched his bulls become shadows of themselves. He watched Brutus, once so proud and strong, standing at the fence like a heartbroken dog waiting for his owner. And finally, he made a decision that he knew his practical farmer friends would think was completely mad. He called Sarah. "You want us to drive 400 kilometers so a bull can see a Chihuahua?" Sarah asked, incredulous. "I know how it sounds, but Sarah, they're grieving. These animals are grieving for your daughter's dog. I never thought I'd say that about bulls, but I'm watching it happen, and I can't just let them suffer if there's something we can do." Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then he heard Emma's voice in the background. Excited. Sarah came back on the line. "Emma's already packing Peanut's bag. We'll be there Saturday morning." The news that Peanut was coming spread through the district faster than a bushfire. Neighbors who'd seen the viral videos wanted to witness the reunion. The local newspaper wanted to cover it. Gary, who'd always valued his privacy, found himself organizing what amounted to an event. Saturday morning arrived with crystal-clear skies. Sarah's car pulled up at 80, and before she'd even turned off the engine, Emma had burst out with Peanut in her arms. The little dog was already yapping, that high-pitched bark that had started everything. The bulls heard it. Gary watched as 15 heads lifted in unison, ears pricked forward. Then, in a movement that was almost orchestrated, they began walking towards the fence. Not running, not charging, but walking with purpose. Brutus was in the lead, his massive body moving faster than Gary had seen in days. Emma ran to the fence, holding Peanut up. The little dog was going crazy, her whole body wiggling with excitement. When Brutus reached the fence, he lowered his head to his usual position, and Peanut stretched out from Emma's arms to touch his nose. The bull closed his eyes, made that rumbling sound in his chest, and just stood there reconnecting with this impossible friend. "Oh my God," Sarah breathed. "It's real, it's actually real." The other bulls crowded around, all trying to get close to Peanut. It was like a reunion of long-lost friends. The transformation in the bulls was immediate and obvious. The listlessness vanished. They were animated, vocal, present in a way they hadn't been since Peanut left. Gary stood back, watching this scene that defied everything he thought he knew about cattle. Tommy was beside him, filming on his phone, tears running down his weathered face. "You know what this means, don't you, boss?" Tommy said. "You can't keep them apart now. It'll kill those bulls inside. Maybe not their bodies, but their spirits." Gary nodded slowly. He'd already been thinking about it, about what it would mean, about the logistics, the complications, the sheer impracticality of what he was considering. "Emma," he called. "Sarah, come here for a minute." They walked over, Emma still holding Peanut, the little dog now calm and content. "I've got a proposal," Gary said, "and I want you to think about it seriously before you answer." Gary took a deep breath, looking at his daughter and granddaughter standing in the red dust of his station, a tiny Chihuahua in the girl's arms and 15 massive bulls watching from the fence. What if Emma and Peanut came to stay here? Properly. I mean, during the school term, Emma could do School of the Air, distance education. She'd stay with me, have Peanut with her, and the bulls would have their friend. "Sarah, you could visit whenever you wanted. I know it's a lot to ask. But—" "Yes!" Emma shrieked before Gary could finish. "Grandpa! Yes! Please! Mum! Please!" Sarah looked torn. Gary could see the conflict in her face. Emma was her only child. The idea of her living 400 kilometers away, even with her own father, was clearly difficult. But she was also looking at those bulls, at the obvious distress they'd experienced, at the genuine bond that had formed. "Can I think about it?" she asked. "Maybe talk to Emma's school, see if it's even feasible." "Of course," Gary said. "I know it's asking a lot, but I'll take good care of her. You know I will." Over the next month, plans took shape. Emma's school approved distance education for the remainder of the year. Sarah negotiated her work schedule to allow monthly visits to the station. A small bedroom in the homestead was converted into a study space for Emma, complete with a computer for her online lessons. And Peanut, tiny guardian of giant bulls, became a permanent resident of the cattle station. The transformation was remarkable. The bulls returned to their normal routines, but with a new element. Every morning, Emma would take Peanut to the fence, and the bulls would come. It became a ritual, this daily communion between the smallest and largest creatures on the property. Emma did her school lessons in the morning, then spent afternoons at the fence, reading aloud to the bulls while Peanut sat on her lap. The massive animals would lie down, chewing their cud, listening to this small human voice reading stories about adventure and magic. Tommy started calling it the most expensive dog-sitting service in Australia, given that 15 bulls essentially organized their day around a Chihuahua's schedule. But he said it with affection, because he'd seen how the bulls had changed. They were calmer, less aggressive with the stockmen, more manageable during musters. It was as if Peanut's presence had brought peace to the entire herd. The story continued to attract attention. Dr. Chen published her findings in a prestigious animal behavior journal, though she noted that many of her colleagues remained skeptical. A children's book was indeed written, titled Peanut and the Bulls, with proceeds going to animal welfare charities. The station became something of a tourist attraction, with Gary reluctantly agreeing to allow small groups to visit twice a month, as long as they maintained a respectful distance and didn't disturb the animals. But for Gary, the most profound change was internal. He'd spent his entire adult life viewing his cattle as commodities. They were units of production, valuable for their meat and breeding potential. He'd always treated them well, of course, given them good feed and proper care, but he'd never really seen them as individuals with their own emotional lives, their own capacity for connection and feeling. Watching Brutus with Peanut changed that fundamentally. This bull, whom he'd considered dangerous and aggressive, was capable of gentleness and attachment. All 15 bulls had demonstrated empathy, protection, and what could only be called friendship towards a creature who could offer them nothing material in return. One evening, 6 months after Peanut had first wandered into that paddock, Gary sat on the veranda with Emma. Peanut was asleep in the girl's lap, and in the distance they could see the bulls settling down for the night. Brutus, as always, was closest to the homestead, closest to where Peanut was. "And does Grandpa," Emma said sleepily, "do you think Peanut knows she saved the bulls?" "Saved them? What do you mean, love?" "Tommy told me that Brutus used to hurt people, that all the bulls were mean, but now they're nice. Peanut changed them. She saved them from being mean." Gary considered this. It was a child's way of looking at it, but there was truth there. The bulls had changed, gentled by their attachment to this tiny, vulnerable creature who trusted them completely. "Maybe she did," he said softly. "Maybe they saved each other." A year after the incident, Sarah made an unexpected announcement. She'd been offered a job in Catherine, only an hour from the station. She'd be able to see Emma every weekend. But more than that, she'd been thinking about her own life, about what mattered. The viral story of Peanut and the bulls had made her question her priorities, made her want to be closer to what was real and meaningful. Emma thrived in her new life. Her grades improved with the one-on-one attention of distance education. She became confident and capable, learning station skills from Gary and Tommy. And every day, without fail, she spent time at the fence with Peanut and the bulls. Brutus lived for another 5 years after that first encounter. When he finally died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 11, Gary found Peanut sitting by his body, the little dog's head resting against the massive bull's side. They buried Brutus near the homestead, and Emma planted a tree there. Peanut would visit the spot regularly, sitting quietly as if keeping vigil. The other bulls continued the tradition of gathering at the fence when Emma and Peanut appeared. New bulls, brought in for breeding, would learn from the older ones that this tiny dog was special, was protected, was part of their family in a way that transcended species. When Emma turned 18 and headed to university to study veterinary science, Peanut was 13, ancient for a Chihuahua. Gary had expected Emma to take the little dog with her, but Emma asked if Peanut could stay on the station. "She belongs here, Grandpa," Emma explained. "This is her home. The bulls need her. And honestly, I think she needs them too." Peanut lived another 2 years, spending every day of them at the fence with the bulls. When she finally passed away quietly in her sleep, Gary buried her next to Brutus. He didn't try to hide his tears as he dug the small grave. Tommy helped him place a stone marker, carved with simple words, "Peanut, the smallest guardian." The bulls grieved again. For days they stood at the fence, waiting for a tiny friend who would never return. But gradually they healed, as animals do. And though no dog ever took Peanut's place, the herd retained the gentleness she'd taught them. Years later, when Gary was interviewed for a documentary about animal behavior, he was asked what he'd learned from the experience. I learned that I'd spent 40 years working with animals I didn't really understand, he said simply. I thought I knew cattle because I could predict their behavior, manage their movements, maximize their productivity, but I didn't know them. Not really. It took a 1.8-kilogram Chihuahua to show me that these massive, supposedly simple creatures were capable of love, of loyalty, of sacrifice. Peanut didn't charm the bulls. She revealed them, showed us who they'd been all along, if only we'd been wise enough to see it. Emma became a vet specializing in large animal behavior. In her clinic, there's a photograph of a tiny tan Chihuahua sitting calmly while a massive Brahman bull lowers his head to touch her with his nose. Under it, a caption reads, "Size doesn't determine strength. Courage doesn't require bulk. And sometimes the most unlikely friendships teach us the most important lessons about the capacity for love." A Chihuahua came face to face with bulls, and everyone was shocked by what happened. But the real shock wasn't the lack of violence. It was the presence of something more profound, recognition, connection, and a bond that transcended every logical expectation. In a world that often seems divided by difference, Peanut and the bulls showed that what unites us, what makes us reach out to protect and cherish, runs deeper than species or size or what we think should be possible. Sometimes, the smallest among us carry the biggest lessons, and sometimes those we consider fierce and dangerous are simply waiting for someone small enough to teach them gentleness.